Hi guys, Miss Hall here with another video for World Civilizations at Research Triangle High School. Today we're going to be talking about the effects of World War I, particularly in Europe. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify the effects of the war on England, the United States, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. You should be able to define the terms creditor, famine, and reparation, and you should understand the economic impact of the war in Europe and how that led to World War II. We're going to start out by talking about the US and the UK. England had been the center of the Great British Empire before World War I, but the war marks the beginning of the decline of that empire. There were, nationalistic demands for independence throughout the non-European world. But the bigger problem that faced England was that they had been the great creditor nation of the world, meaning that they had provided monetary loans and shipping and insurance services to the rest of the world. But the cost of the war was so great that England consumed all of its credits and actually became heavily indebted to the United States. As a result of the war, the world's financial center shifted from England to the US, from London to New York. The US, who was removed by a whole ocean from the center of the war and joined the war late, didn't suffer the same kind of catastrophic losses that the major European participants suffered. They did suffer a lot of losses of life. There were more than 100,000 killed, but that was actually small in comparison to the millions lost by the European powers. Furthermore, the war stimulated the U.S. economy. It increased employment and wages and brought great profit to the U.S. industries. And the United States actually emerged from the war as the greatest power in the world. Now, in both nations, the working class people and women who were fully employed during the war gained new rights and new status, and the distribution of income actually shifted in favor of the poor. Conversely, France and Russia were some of the hardest hit nations by the war. In France, heavy losses in manpower at the Western Front decimated an entire generation of Frenchmen, which came to be known as the Lost Generation. It's thought that this created a leadership vacuum when that generation came of age, and therefore they were less able to sustain their wartime losses. France also suffered untold property damage since most of the war was fought on French soil. In Russia, the war led to the Russian Revolution and a civil war which continued the conflict for 3 years beyond World War I. The revolution came earlier than it otherwise would have under the circumstances of war, and it really happened before the leadership was prepared to establish a stable alternative to the Tsar, and that led to an almost total disintegration of their economy, and by 1921, there was a mass famine or shortage of food. Austria-Hungary basically collapsed during the war, torn apart by its multinational divisions, and although the treaty negotiators recognized a new political arrangement after the war, it also lacked stability. It was impossible to put to rest the multi-ethnic tensions between the people in the regions. Czechoslovakia was a relatively stable new state in the north, though it was also divided between two Slavic nationalities and included many Germans as well as Polish and Hungarian minorities. Romania was one of the Allied nations and was given a large share of territory, but that was territory that was inhabited by Hungarians. The greatest uncertainty, however, was in the areas where different ethnic groups could not be separated from one another and were included in the new multinational state of Yugoslavia. Both the Austrian and the Ottoman empires also had been destroyed without there being a real stable alternative. In the former European portion of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic emerged, while Albanians mingled with Greeks in Greece and Serbs in Yugoslavia. In general, this region was a patchwork of multinational states that would lead to conflict later. The nation on which the war had the most profound effect was Germany. Germany had entered World War I as the greatest power among the Central Forces, and its people were immensely proud of Germany's achievements. Defeat in the war was a profound shock, and coupled with the economic collapse. It was really more than the German people could accept. England and France and other debtor nations could not pay their debts unless they received the reparations from Germany, and Germany owed $33 billion in reparations to these nations. But Germany was so devastated by war that there was no way they could finance their own recovery and pay for reparations. And so in 1923, they defaulted on their loans and experienced massive inflation. Basically, the economy throughout Europe was devastated by the war, and when Germany defaulted on their loans in 1923, financial reforms had to be introduced to stabilize the economy, and the only real way to accomplish that was to create a means by which the American investors could invest in German recovery. And beginning in 1924, under the Dawes Plan, German bonds were sold to American private investors, and that enabled the German economy to recover and allowed them to make their reparation payments. But the problem with the system was that it was based upon the U.S. economy, and as long as the U.S. economy was prosperous, the system worked. However, when the U.S. economy failed, the system collapsed. The war had created the circumstances by which Europe was helpless before the depression which struck the U.S. in 1929. The economic nationalism further caused world trade to be cut and exacerbated the depression. Widespread unemployment and economic hardship was prevalent throughout the world. The depression in Europe and Asia actually created the desperate conditions and insecurity which allowed fascism to develop, and that and the rise of fascism and the depression is what led to World War II. We can say that World War I created the conditions which caused World War II. What's next? Well, as always, make sure you have taken good notes and reviewed this video and are ready for a quiz on it. We're also going to take a look at some of the more pleasant aspects of life in the 1920s. You'll also have your eye out for a new video on how this war and the effects of it did lead to World War II and the rise of dictators.